You're here because you want to get smart fast on what really matters. And this deep dive is built exactly for that, cutting through the noise to give you the core understanding of a topic, without all the overwhelm.
Yeah, absolutely. And today we're diving into something that, well, a lot of people might be curious about, especially as they focus on staying active and healthy as they age. The big question is, can creatine supplements actually give your muscles a real boost later in life?
Exactly. We're looking at a pretty recent article here. It was published just this May, May 2nd, 2025. The title is, Can Creatine Supplements Help Older Adults' Muscles? Here's what to know.
Right.
So our mission really is to unpack what the latest research is saying, the potential upsides, but also, the important things you need to keep in mind.
And it's interesting because creatine, well, it's got this big reputation in the sports world, right?
Yeah,
For athletes.
totally. But we're specifically looking at its role beyond that, focusing on supporting healthy aging.
Right. For a long time, creatine talk was mostly about younger athletes trying to, boost performance, build muscle. It's pretty well established there.
Sure.
But the really interesting question now is whether older adults who might be dealing with that sort of natural age-related muscle loss, maybe a dip in strength, could they see similar benefits?
And what's grabbing my attention is that the evidence seems to be, well, leaning towards yes on that. This article we're looking at highlights a growing body of research suggesting creatine can actually amplify the effects of resistance training for older folks.
That's right. Now, it's fair to say a lot of these studies are still relatively small scale,
Okay.
but the findings, they are showing some promising trends. We're seeing these, small but statistically significant increases in both muscle mass and strength. That's when older adults combine creatine with regular weightlifting.
And it's not just about the numbers on a scale or how much you can lift, right? It seems like these gains actually translate into real-world improvements.
Exactly. The article mentions improvements in what scientists call functional health markers.
Okay, functional health markers.
hmm
What does that mean in practical terms?
It means things like being able to stand up more easily from a chair or walking a bit faster, everyday stuff.
Right, things that really impact independence.
Well, precisely.
Huh.
And this is according to Phil Chillibeck. He's a professor of kinesiology at the University of Saskatchewan. He really emphasizes these practical benefits, like, carrying groceries, climbing stairs, just getting out of a low chair without needing help, that kind of thing.
That makes a huge difference in quality of life.
It really does.
Yeah.
But Chillibeck also offers a balanced view. He points out that while creatine can definitely help, the main engine driving muscle health is still the resistance training itself. He actually says creatine can help out, but it's going to add a small benefit compared to what you can get with a good resistance training program by itself.
Okay, that makes total sense. So it's like a booster, not the main event.
Exactly. It's not a magic pill.
But what I found really interesting, despite that caveat, Chillibeck also says, if you're going to be spending your money on a nutritional supplement, I think it's the one to choose. That sounds like a pretty strong endorsement, considering.
It is a strong statement, but again, it's important for you, the listener, to remember that the research specifically in older adults is, well, still growing.
Right.
The article does note that many studies so far have used smaller groups.
That's a crucial piece of context.
Mhm.
Okay, so for those of us maybe not steeped in exercise science,
Mhm.
can we just quickly break down the basics? How does creatine actually, work? What's it doing in the body?
Sure. Think of creatine as like readily available fuel for your muscles, especially during intense bursts of activity.
Okay.
It helps regenerate a key energy molecule called ATP. ATP is basically the direct power source your cells use for quick, powerful movements.
Right, like lifting a heavy weight or
Yeah.
sprinting.
Exactly. So by having more creatine available, your muscles can potentially replenish that ATP faster, allowing you to maybe squeeze out an extra rep or two or maintain speed for a little longer.
Got it.
Abby Smith-Ryan, she's a professor of exercise physiology at UNC, explains this process really well.
And she had this quote that really stuck with me, kind of challenged the stereotype. She said something like, people think it's a scary meathead bodybuilding supplement.
Yeah.
I would send it to my 95-year-old grandmother and tell her to put it in her yogurt. I just love that reframing. It makes it sound much more normal, for everyday health.
It really does cut through that perception. And it's worth remembering creatine isn't some, synthetic alien substance.
Right.
Our bodies actually make it naturally, about 1 to 2 grams a day, mainly in the liver and kidneys. Phil Chillibeck mentioned this.
And we get some from food, too.
Yep, primarily from meat and fish.
And this seemed like a key point in the article. Getting enough from diet alone to reach those supplemental levels is really hard.
Very.
Like, to get the typical 5-gram supplement dose, you'd need to eat, what was it, something like 3.5 pounds of meat or fish?
Yeah, roughly that amount. It really puts those little scoops into perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so that brings us back to why combining it with resistance training seems so crucial, especially for older adults.
Exactly. The current research is really zeroing in on how creatine can sort of amplify the benefits you're already getting from lifting weights.
The article talks about a meta-analysis that Chillibeck co-authored. Just to clarify for everyone, a meta-analysis is basically a way to pool data from lots of different studies to get a bigger picture, right?
That's it. A very powerful tool. This one looked at 20 separate randomized controlled trials, so good quality studies. And the participants were adults aged between 48 and 84.
Okay, a decent age range.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the big finding when they crunched all that data?
The main takeaway was pretty clear. The groups who took creatine and did resistance training, usually 2 or 3 times a week, gained significantly more lean muscle mass and strength compared to the groups who did the exact same exercise program, but got a placebo, a dummy pill.
So it really is that combination, the synergy, that seems to make the difference.
Precisely. And the article touches on why that might be. It seems that exercise itself actually enhances the muscle's ability to take up and store creatine.
Ah, okay. So working out primes the muscles to use the creatine better.
That seems to be part of it. There's also some thought that maybe older muscles are slightly less efficient at taking up creatine naturally, which might be why a supplemental dose, maybe even slightly higher in some cases, could be particularly beneficial for older adults compared to younger ones, just to reach those optimal levels.
And this feels like a really critical piece of information. Taking the creatine without the resistance training doesn't seem to cut it for muscle building, does it?
No, that's a crucial distinction the article makes. They highlight a specific study from Brazil. It followed 200 older women for 2 full years.
Okay.
And the finding was that creatine, on its own, didn't significantly impact their lean mass or muscle function if they weren't also doing resistance exercise.
Wow. So you can't just pop a pill and expect results without putting in the work.
Seems not. And Shivani Sani, she's an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, really hammers this point home. She's quoted saying, "Certainly, if you're not doing any resistance training, I wouldn't bother taking creatine."
Pretty blunt.
Yeah. And she also makes a really valid point about needing more research, specifically larger studies that include more older women and also people who might be considered more frail to really understand the effects across the board.
That makes sense. Okay, this also brings up an important practical point. Potential health checks or considerations.
Wow.
Our bodies break down creatine into something called creatinine, right? And doctors measure that for kidney function.
That's correct.
So what's the connection there? Should people be concerned?
Well, the article points out that taking creatine supplements can raise creatinine levels in your blood slightly, but it's important to know that other things can too, like simply having more muscle mass or even eating a very high-protein diet.
Ah, okay.
Kirk Campbell, who's the president of the National Kidney Foundation, highlights this. The key thing isn't necessarily panic,
Right.
but communication. Because doctors use creatinine as a marker for kidney health, elevated levels from creatine could potentially be misinterpreted if your doctor doesn't know you're taking it.
So the advice is,
Definitely let your doctor know you're using creatine, especially crucial if you have any pre-existing kidney issues. It's just about keeping everyone informed so they can interpret your lab results correctly.
okay, really good advice. Now, another interesting point raised was that not everyone reacts the same way. Some people apparently don't get much benefit.
Yeah, that's right. Brad Schoenfeld, he's a professor in exercise science at Lehman College, talks about this. He refers to them as non-responders.
Non-responders. Why might that be?
It could be down to a few things, possibly genetics, maybe differences in muscle fiber types, or how efficiently their bodies transport creatine naturally. But another simple explanation Schoenfeld offers is that some people might just already have their muscle creatine stores naturally topped up, pretty much full, just from their regular diet.
Ah.
And he says, quite logically, if your creatine stores are already full from your diet, taking extra creatine isn't going to make any difference.
Right. If the tank's full, adding more won't help. That makes perfect sense.
Exactly. And interestingly, this might explain why, as the article suggests, people following a vegan diet often see the most benefit.
Because their dietary intake is naturally lower.
Precisely. Their baseline levels are likely lower, so the supplement provides a much bigger relative boost.
Fascinating. Okay, shifting gears slightly. Beyond muscles, The article briefly mentions some early research into potential cognitive benefits. What's the story there?
Yeah, this is definitely an emerging area, and as Phil Chilibek himself cautions, this work is still very preliminary, so we need to be careful not to overstate it.
Got it.
Yeah.
Preliminary. But what's the basic idea?
Well, the brain uses a ton of energy, right? It's incredibly active.
Sure.
The thinking is that having extra creatine available might provide the brain with a sort of extra energy reserve. This could be particularly helpful during times of stress, like if you're sleep deprived, maybe dealing with jet lag, things like that.
Okay, so like an energy backup for the brain?
Kinda.
Yeah.
Eric Rawson from Messiah University and Darren Kandow at the University of Regina are researchers looking into this. Kandow uses this nice analogy, saying creatine sort of comes to the rescue when the brain's energy demands are high.
Comes to the rescue. I like that.
But again, Kandow adds the necessary caution. It's not a miracle, but it can provide some benefits. So potential there, but definitely needs more robust research before we can make strong claims.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so for listeners who might be considering trying creatine after hearing all this, what are the practical takeaways? What should they actually do?
Right. The article gives some clear advice based on expert consensus. First off, the type to look for is creatine monohydrate.
Monohydrate. Why that one?
It's simply the form that's been studied the most extensively by far. Abby Smith-Ryan recommends sticking with that one. It's effective and generally the most affordable, too.
Okay, creatine monohydrate. And what about dosage?
The general recommendation is pretty straightforward. Start with around 5 grams per day.
5 grams. What about those loading phases you sometimes hear about, taking much more initially?
Yeah, experts like Darren Kandow generally say those aren't really necessary for most people, especially older adults just looking for health benefits.
Okay.
Loading might saturate muscles slightly faster, but it can also increase the chance of side effects like bloating or stomach upset. 5 grams a day consistently seems to work well without that.
Good to know. And finally, what about making sure you're getting a quality product? Supplements aren't always tightly regulated, are they?
That's a really critical point. The FDA doesn't pre-approve supplements for safety or effectiveness before they hit the shelves.
Right.
So Chilibek and others strongly recommend looking for products that are third-party tested. Look for certifications like NSF Certified for Sport or Informed Sport. These seals mean an independent organization has tested the product to verify that what's on the label is actually in the bottle and that it doesn't contain unsafe contaminants.
Okay, third-party testing. That's key. So let's try and wrap this up. What's the main message you want people to take away from this deep dive?
I think the core message is this. For healthy older adults, if you combine creatine supplementation, specifically monohydrate, around 5 grams a day with a consistent resistance training program.
The exercise part being key.
Absolutely key. Then you may see a small but potentially meaningful boost in your muscle mass and strength, and that boost could translate into better functional ability in your daily life.
But we really have to stress, again, that the resistance training is the foundation, right? Creatine is the helper, not the hero.
Couldn't have said it better. Exercise is primary. Creatine appears to be a potentially useful addition to that exercise, not a replacement for it.
And we need to remember the nuances we talked about, too.
Definitely. Remember that the research specifically in older populations is still growing, that not everyone responds the same way.
Right, they're non-responders.
Exactly. And crucially, always have that conversation with your doctor before starting any new supplement, especially if you have any underlying health conditions, particularly kidney issues.
Sound advice. You know, this whole discussion leaves me thinking, with this growing interest in maintaining muscle and strength as we age, which is so important.
Yeah.
And given that creatine seems relatively low risk for most healthy people, what's next? Could future research or maybe more personalized approaches unlock even more benefits? It really makes you consider that interplay between diet, exercise, and maybe targeted supplementation as we get older.
It's a fascinating area and definitely one to keep an eye on. Lots more to learn, I think.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for breaking all that down for us, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive.